My name is Crystal Warren, and at 67 years old, I never imagined my son James would break my heart like this. After supporting him his entire life, especially paying $650,000 for his and Stephanie's dream house, I received a text that changed everything. "Mom, you weren't invited to dinner. My wife doesn't want you there." I stared at those words on my phone screen, my hands trembling as 39 years of motherhood seemed to crumble around me. What happened next shocked even me. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved unconditionally. I became a single mother when my husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack. James was only 5 years old, then a small boy with his father's curious eyes and my stubborn chin. We had been living a comfortable middle-class life in a small suburban home outside of Philadelphia. Robert had a good job as an engineer, and I worked part-time as a school administrator. Everything changed that Tuesday morning when I got the call from the hospital. The initial grief was overwhelming, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I had a little boy who needed me. Within months, I had to sell our home as the mortgage was too much on my single income. We moved to a modest 2-bedroom apartment, and I took on a full-time position at the school plus weekend shifts at a local department store. Those early years were a blur of exhaustion. I would wake at 5 in the morning to prepare James's lunch before dropping him off at before-school care. Then I'd work until 5, pick him up from after-school care, make dinner, help with homework, and tuck him in. On weekends, James would sit quietly reading books in the employee break room while I worked my retail shift. There were many nights when I would collapse into bed, wondering how I could keep going. But one look at James sleeping peacefully was all the motivation I needed. Despite our financial struggles, James and I had a beautiful relationship. Every Sunday was our special day. We couldn't afford much, but we would go to the local park, feed the ducks, and share an ice cream cone. As he grew older, these outings evolved into nature hikes and visits to free museum days. I made sure he never felt poor, even when I was stretching every dollar to breaking point. James was a bright student from the beginning. His teachers would comment on his sharp mind and natural curiosity. I encouraged his love of learning, bringing home books from library sales and helping him with science projects long into the night. When he was 12, he developed an interest in finance after a school career day. He started reading the business section of the newspaper and asking questions about stocks and investments. By the time James reached high school, he was focused on getting a business degree. I began saving every extra penny for his college fund. I went without new clothes, haircuts, or any personal indulgences for years. I even took out a modest second mortgage on the small house I had finally been able to purchase when James was 14. When he received a partial scholarship to Penn State, I cried with pride and relief. College was a challenging time financially, but James thrived academically. He would call me twice a week without fail, sharing stories about his classes and the internship he secured at a local financial firm. He graduated with honors, and I sat in the audience at his graduation ceremony, tears streaming down my face, thinking of how proud Robert would have been. After college, James was fortunate to land a job at a respected financial consulting firm in Philadelphia. He rented a small apartment downtown, but would drive out to my house every Sunday for dinner. This became our new tradition. I would spend the morning preparing his favorite meals, and we would talk for hours about his work, his ambitions, and occasionally his dating life, which seemed perpetually stalled due to his intense work schedule. As James's career advanced, I noticed subtle changes. Our Sunday dinners occasionally got canceled due to work commitments. When he did come, he would sometimes be distracted, checking his phone, or talking about the pressures of his job. I understood he was building his career and never complained. I was proud of his dedication and success. By the time I retired from my school administrator position at 62, James had been promoted twice. He insisted on taking me out to an expensive restaurant to celebrate my retirement. Over dinner, he thanked me for all the sacrifices I had made. "Mom, everything I am today is because of you," he said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "Someday, I'm going to make sure you have everything you deserve." I had a modest but comfortable retirement. My house was nearly paid off, and I had managed to save a decent amount in my retirement accounts, despite the years of financial struggle. I had always been cautious with money, a habit born from necessity. Even when my financial situation improved in later years, I maintained an emergency fund and lived below my means. James seemed genuinely happy when he would visit, though our Sunday dinners had dwindled to once or twice a month. He would share stories about work functions, business trips, and the fancy restaurants his job allowed him to experience. I was living vicariously through him, in many ways delighted that my son had opportunities I never had. I had such hopes and dreams for James. I wanted him to find a loving partner, perhaps start a family if he wanted children, and achieve the success and stability that had been so hard-won in my own life. Most of all, I wanted him to be happy. When he called me one Sunday to cancel our dinner because he had met someone special, I felt nothing but joy. Little did I know that this would be the beginning of the end of the close relationship I had cherished for nearly 4 decades. James called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Mom, I want you to meet someone. Her name is Stephanie. Can we come for dinner this Sunday?" I was thrilled. James rarely dated seriously, always claiming his work kept him too busy for relationships. I spent the entire week preparing. I cleaned every corner of my modest home, planned a special menu, and even bought new dishes for the occasion. When Sunday arrived, I was a bundle of nerves and excitement. The moment Stephanie walked through my door, I noticed she was strikingly beautiful with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking outfit. She was younger than James by several years, probably in her late 20s. She offered me a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she handed me a bottle of wine that I later discovered cost more than my weekly grocery budget. During dinner, I tried to make conversation, asking about her family and job. Stephanie worked in luxury real estate and came from a wealthy family in Connecticut. Her responses were polite but clipped, and I noticed she barely touched the home-cooked meal I had spent hours preparing. Instead, she kept steering the conversation toward upscale restaurants she and James had visited, and vacations her family took to Europe. When James excused himself to take a phone call, Stephanie glanced around my living room and said, "This place has a certain charm. Very retro." The way she said it made it clear she meant outdated. I brushed off the comment, telling myself I was being oversensitive. As they were leaving, James hugged me tightly. "Isn't she amazing, Mom?" he whispered. I nodded and smiled, not wanting to dampen his obvious happiness, though a small voice inside me was raising concerns I couldn't quite articulate. Their relationship progressed at whirlwind speed. Within 3 months, James called to tell me they were engaged. "I know it seems fast, Mom, but when you know, he explained. I was surprised but supportive. James was 35, certainly old enough to make his own decisions. The wedding planning quickly became an exercise in excess. Stephanie's parents were wealthy, but they only offered to pay for the rehearsal dinner, leaving the bulk of the expenses to James, who turned to me for help. I withdrew $20,000 from my retirement savings to contribute money I had earmarked for potential medical expenses in my later years. The wedding was held at an exclusive country club. Stephanie had 8 bridesmaids in designer dresses, and the floral arrangements alone cost more than my first car. During the reception, I found myself seated at a table far from the main party with distant relatives I barely knew. When I approached James for a dance, Stephanie intercepted, saying they needed to greet her father's business associates. I later learned that Stephanie came from a family that valued status and appearances above all else. Her father had made his fortune in commercial real estate, and her mother was heavily involved in elite social circles. Stephanie had attended private schools and an Ivy League university. Compared to their world, my middle-class life must have seemed quaint at best. After the wedding, I noticed, James began declining my invitations more frequently. When they did visit, Stephanie would make subtle comments about my home, my clothes, or my cooking. "Oh, is that what people wore in your generation?" Or, "This recipe is interesting. So traditional." James's behavior changed noticeably when Stephanie was present. The son who once engaged in deep conversations with me now seemed distracted and eager to leave. He would check his watch repeatedly or exchange glances with Stephanie that I pretended not to notice. I made numerous attempts to build a relationship with my new daughter-in-law. I invited her for lunch, sent thoughtful gifts on her birthday, and asked about her interests. Stephanie would respond with surface-level politeness, but never reciprocated or opened up. When I mentioned this to James, he became defensive. "She's just busy, Mom. Her job is really demanding." Family gatherings became increasingly tense. At Thanksgiving, I prepared traditional dishes that James had loved since childhood. Stephanie picked at her food and later suggested they should host next year. "We could have it catered properly," she said, as if my home-cooked meal was somehow inadequate. Christmas was worse. I had carefully selected gifts for both of them, spending more than I should have on a cashmere sweater for Stephanie. She opened it with a thin smile and a quick thanks before setting it aside. Later, I overheard her telling James it wasn't her style and asking if I had kept the receipt. Through all of this, I kept my concerns to myself. James seemed happy, or at least I convinced myself he was. He had a new confidence that came with being part of Stephanie's world. They attended charity galas and exclusive parties. His career was advancing rapidly, partly due to connections through Stephanie's family. I told myself that my discomfort was just the natural adjustment to no longer being the primary woman in my son's life. But as the first year of their marriage progressed, I couldn't ignore the growing distance. Sunday calls became monthly, then sporadic. James's voice on the phone sounded hurried, distracted. He would promise to visit soon, but those visits rarely materialized. When I asked if everything was okay, he would assure me he was just busy with work and married life. I kept these worries to myself, not wanting to burden my friends with what might be simple empty nest syndrome. But deep down, I feared I was losing my son to a world where I didn't belong, and to a woman who seemed determined to erase his past, including me. The call came on a Saturday morning in April, almost 2 years after James and Stephanie's wedding. James sounded more excited than I had heard him in months. "Mom, we found it, the perfect house. Can we come over this afternoon to tell you all about it?" They arrived bearing champagne and a folder of glossy photos. The house was certainly beautiful, a 5-bedroom colonial in an exclusive suburb with manicured lawns and a 2-story foyer. As they showed me pictures of marble countertops and cathedral ceilings, I noticed Stephanie was more animated and friendly than I had ever seen her. "It's listed at $850,000, James said, his voice slightly hesitant. "It's a bit above our budget, but Stephanie says it's actually underpriced for the neighborhood." I nodded, wondering why they were sharing this with me in such detail. James had mentioned they were house hunting, but I assumed they were looking in a more modest price range. James had a good income, but nowhere near enough to afford a house of this caliber. After showing me all the photos, they exchanged a look, and James cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to talk about something important." His tone had changed, and I immediately sensed what was coming. "We've been approved for a mortgage, but we're short on the down payment. We need about $150,000 to secure the house and avoid PMI. Stephanie jumped in, her voice honeyed. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely perfect, Crystal. It's in the best school district, and there's a beautiful room that would be perfect as a guest suite for when you visit." This was the first time she had ever suggested I might be welcome to stay in their home. I sat quietly processing their request. James continued explaining how property in this area was a solid investment, how the house had everything they wanted for their future family. "We're planning to start trying for a baby soon," he added, knowing how much I longed for grandchildren. The conversation lasted hours. I asked about their finances, learning they had some savings, but had recently spent significantly on luxury vacations and furnishing their current apartment. Stephanie mentioned her parents had offered $20,000, but couldn't do more right now due to other commitments. I was torn. Part of me was hurt they would ask for such a large sum, knowing it would mean dipping substantially into my retirement security. Another part was touched that James still turned to me in important moments, and I couldn't deny the appeal of potentially having grandchildren raised in a beautiful, safe home where I would be welcome to visit. After they left, I spent days reviewing my finances. I had approximately $380,000 in retirement accounts, plus about $70,000 in emergency savings. My house was nearly paid off, with only $30,000 remaining on the mortgage. Helping them would mean withdrawing a significant portion of my security net, including penalties for early withdrawal. I called my financial advisor, who strongly cautioned against it. "Crystal, this is your retirement security we're talking about. At your age, you need to protect these assets." But maternal love often overrides financial sense. I thought about all the things I had wanted to give James over the years, but couldn't afford. I remembered the cramped apartment we lived in after his father died, the second-hand clothes, the vacations we never took. Perhaps this was my chance to finally give him something substantial. I called James and told him I would help. His relief and gratitude were palpable. "Mom, you're amazing. We'll pay you back, I promise. And we'll set up that guest room right away." We met with my attorney to formalize the arrangement. I insisted on a legal document stating the money was a loan, though I kept the interest minimal. James readily agreed. Stephanie was effusive with her thanks, mentioning plans for family dinners and holidays in their new home. The withdrawal from my retirement accounts was painful physically and emotionally. I had to sign multiple documents, acknowledging the penalties and tax implications. The financial advisor made one last attempt to dissuade me. "You're compromising your future security, Crystal," but I had made up my mind. I provided $150,000 for the down payment, plus an additional $50,000 to help with closing costs and initial furnishings. It represented nearly half of my retirement savings, but I told myself it was an investment in family bonds as much as in property. The day of closing, James called me in tears. "Mom, we got the keys. I can't believe this is happening. We owe it all to you." They invited me to see the house the following weekend, and I brought a small housewarming gift, a handmade quilt I had actually started when James was in college, thinking it would someday go in his first home. As Stephanie showed me around, I made two small requests. First, could I have a spare key just in case of emergencies? Second, could we establish a tradition of monthly family dinners in their new dining room? Both James and Stephanie readily agreed. James hung the quilt in the guest room, which Stephanie referred to as Crystal's room, though I noticed she quickly added they would need to purchase proper bedroom furniture before I could actually stay overnight. Driving home that evening, I felt conflicted. The amount I had given them was staggering when I considered my modest lifestyle and careful saving habits. Yet I had hopes this generosity would strengthen our family bonds and secure my place in their lives. Within weeks, I began noticing concerning signs. I called to arrange our first monthly dinner, but Stephanie said they were still settling in and would need to postpone. When I suggested dropping by with some homemade cookies, James texted that they were in the middle of decorating, and it wasn't a good time. A month passed, then 2. The promised dinner invitations never materialized. When I called, my conversations with James grew shorter, often with Stephanie's voice audible in the background, seemingly prompting him to end the call. I tried to rationalize these behaviors. New homeowners are busy. Young couples need their space. But a growing sense of unease settled in my stomach as I reviewed bank statements showing the substantial reduction in my retirement accounts alongside the new mortgage payment I was helping them make each month. Summer faded into fall, and the promised monthly family dinners had yet to materialize. When I finally managed to secure an invitation to their home, 3 months after they had moved in, the visit was strained. Stephanie gave me a perfunctory tour, pointing out numerous renovations and purchases they had made. I was shocked to see they had already remodeled the kitchen, replacing the perfectly good countertops with imported Italian marble. "How are you managing all these expenses?" I asked James quietly when Stephanie stepped away. He looked uncomfortable. "We're fine, Mom. The renovations are necessary for the neighborhood standard. Property values, you know." When I attempted to make another visit the following month, James texted that they were swamped with social obligations, but promised to schedule something soon. That pattern continued, with excuses growing increasingly elaborate. They were having the floors refinished. Stephanie's parents were visiting. They had a charity event. James was traveling for work. The holidays approached, and I naturally assumed we would spend Thanksgiving together. When I called to ask what I could bring, Stephanie answered, "Oh, Crystal, we're actually going to my parents' place in Connecticut this year. James didn't mention it. Maybe next year." I spent Thanksgiving alone reheating a small turkey breast and trying not to dwell on the generous financial gift that had apparently bought me nothing in terms of family inclusion. Despite the growing distance, James continued to contact me regularly about the house payments. The original agreement was that I would help with the mortgage for the first year while they established themselves. Yet when I received credit card statements, I noticed charges from luxury retailers, high-end restaurants, and even a vacation to Bermuda. One afternoon, I stopped by, unannounced, with a Christmas wreath for their door, hoping to catch them at home. As I approached the house, I saw multiple cars in the driveway. Through the large front windows, I could see people gathered in the living room, drinks in hand. A dinner party was clearly underway. I quietly left the wreath on the porch and drove away, tears blurring my vision. The next day, James called, his voice tight. "Mom, Stephanie noticed on the security camera that you came by yesterday. We were hosting a dinner for her colleagues. You should really call before coming over." "I noticed," I said quietly. "I was hoping to drop off a Christmas gift. I didn't realize you were entertaining." There was an awkward pause. "Well, thanks for the wreath. Listen, about Christmas. We're thinking of going to Aspen this year. Stephanie wants to try skiing." Each interaction left me feeling increasingly hollow. I began experiencing anxiety symptoms, waking in the night with my heart racing, wondering how my relationship with my only child had deteriorated so dramatically. My doctor prescribed medication for anxiety, and suggested therapy, which I reluctantly began. My friend Lisa, whom I'd known since James was in elementary school, became increasingly concerned. Over coffee one morning, she asked directly, "Crystal, how much money have you given them?" I hesitated before answering truthfully. Lisa was appalled. "And they can't even include you for holidays. Crystal, they're taking advantage of your generosity." "He's my son," I said defensively. "I want him to be happy." "But are you happy?" Lisa pressed. "Are they treating you with the respect you deserve?" I couldn't answer that question honestly. The situation deteriorated further when I overheard a conversation not meant for my ears. I had finally been invited to a casual Sunday brunch 6 months after they moved into the house. I arrived early, letting myself in with the emergency key they had given me. From the kitchen, I could hear them talking upstairs. "Your mother's coming at 11, right?" Stephanie was saying. "Yeah," James replied. "We can get through brunch and then tell her we have plans this afternoon." "I don't see why we need to keep doing this." Stephanie's voice was irritated. "She's always watching how we spend our money making those little comments." "She did help us buy the house," James said, his voice weaker than I remembered from our years together. Stephanie scoffed. "That's what parents do, James. My parents helped too, but they don't expect to be included in everything because of it. Your mother is too needy." I stood frozen, the brunch pastries I had brought growing heavy in my arms. What hurt most wasn't Stephanie's words, but the fact that James didn't defend me. I considered leaving, but instead called out, "Hello, I'm here!" There was a sudden silence upstairs, then the sound of movement. They appeared moments later, all smiles and artificial warmth. That brunch was excruciating. I smiled and made conversation while inwardly processing what I had heard. I noticed how James deferred to Stephanie on everything, how his eyes constantly checked her expression before he spoke. My confident, independent son seemed to have vanished. As the months passed, James's calls became even less frequent. When he did call, it was often about house-related expenses or requests for additional financial help. They needed to replace the water heater. The property taxes were higher than expected. Stephanie's car needed repairs. Each time, I provided what was asked, hoping it might rebuild the bridge between us. But the distance only grew. Invitations to their home dwindled to almost nothing. When I did visit, I felt like an intruder rather than family. The physical toll on me was becoming noticeable. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and found little joy in activities I once loved. Lisa suggested I speak to an attorney about protecting my remaining assets, but I resisted. Taking legal action against my own son seemed unthinkable. But as my 70th birthday approached, I was forced to confront the painful reality of my situation. I was being used financially while being emotionally discarded. The realization came gradually, then suddenly, like water slowly filling a room before a dam breaks. I had allowed my desperate love for my son to blind me to what was happening. I had become an ATM, not a mother in their eyes. My 70th birthday was approaching in late May. Throughout my life, birthdays had been special occasions for James and me. Even during our financially strained years, he would make me handmade cards or save his allowance to buy small gifts. As adults, we had established a tradition of having dinner together on my birthday, just the two of us catching up and reminiscing. Despite the growing distance between us, I held on to hope that this milestone birthday would be different. Perhaps it would serve as a reset button for our relationship. I dropped subtle hints during our increasingly rare phone conversations, mentioning plans to take the day off from my part-time volunteer work at the community library. 2 weeks before my birthday, I was chatting with my neighbor Martha, who mentioned she had seen activity at James and Stephanie's house the previous weekend. Quite the delivery they had, she said casually. Looked like catering supplies. They must be planning quite a party. My heart lifted. Perhaps they were planning a surprise birthday celebration for me. It would explain the lack of birthday dinner discussion. I allowed myself to imagine a gathering with friends and family. James making a heartfelt toast, Stephanie finally embracing me as family. I even went shopping for a new dress, splurging more than I normally would on a flattering blue outfit that matched my eyes. The week of my birthday arrived with no word from James. I told myself that was to be expected if they were planning a surprise. On Wednesday, 2 days before my birthday, I went to the mall to get my hair styled and bought a new lipstick. I felt younger than I had in months, buoyed by anticipation. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, my phone chimed with a text message from James. My heart fluttered as I reached for it, expecting a cryptic birthday-related message or perhaps final details about when to arrive for a celebration. Instead, what I read shattered my carefully constructed hopes. Mom, just letting you know, we're having a dinner party on Friday for some important clients of Stephanie's. You weren't invited to dinner. My wife doesn't want you there. Maybe we can do lunch next week for your birthday instead. I had to read the message 3 times each word, a small dagger. Not only were they not celebrating my birthday, but they were hosting a business dinner on that day. And the wording, "You weren't invited. My wife doesn't want you there," was so cold, so dismissive. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. The sauce I was stirring boiled over, but I barely noticed. I sank into a kitchen chair, feeling physically ill. This was the house I had sacrificed my financial security to help purchase. These were the people I had supported unconditionally. And on my 70th birthday, I was explicitly unwanted. I tried calling James immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. I couldn't bring myself to leave a message. What could I possibly say? I sent a simple text, I see. Thanks for letting me know. That night was one of the longest of my life. I cycled through emotions, hurt, betrayal, anger, grief, and finally a strange emptiness. Sleep eluded me as I stared at the ceiling, replaying not just this final insult, but the pattern of behavior over the past few years. The gradual exclusion, the financial requests, the broken promises and cancellations. Around 3 in the morning, something shifted inside me. A lifetime of putting others first, of making excuses for thoughtless behavior, of sacrificing my needs, suddenly seemed like a heavy coat I could finally remove. I got out of bed, made a cup of tea, and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad. I began writing down every financial contribution I had made to James and Stephanie since they got married. The wedding contribution, the house down payment, the monthly supplements to their mortgage payments, the emergency funds for house repairs and car troubles, the Christmas and birthday gifts that had grown increasingly expensive as my inclusion in their lives had diminished. By dawn, I had filled several pages. The total was staggering, even to me who had lived through each withdrawal and transfer. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the pattern of taking without reciprocating, of using my maternal love as a resource to be exploited rather than a bond to be cherished. As the first light of morning filtered through my kitchen window, I made a decision. I would no longer enable this behavior. I would no longer accept crumbs of affection in exchange for significant financial support. I would no longer pretend that this painful imbalance was normal or acceptable. With surprising calm, I reached for my phone and took a photo of my handwritten list of financial contributions. Then I composed a new text to James. I've been thinking about your message. I understand now where I stand in your lives. I'll be making changes accordingly. Happy hosting. I turned off my phone, took a shower, and for the first time in years, felt the weight of anxiety lifting from my shoulders. The path forward was clear, though it would be painful. Sometimes the only way to help someone recognize your value is to stop providing things they take for granted. After my shower, I dressed with care and had a proper breakfast, something I had often skipped during months of anxiety. Then I drove to my bank, where I had been a customer for over 30 years. The manager, Robert, knew me well and expressed concern when I explained what I needed to do. "Are you absolutely certain, Crystal? These are significant financial changes." "I've never been more certain of anything," I replied. First, I stopped the automatic monthly transfers to James and Stephanie's account money that had been helping with their mortgage payments. Next, I withdrew my name from their house emergency fund, which I had established to cover unexpected repairs. From the bank, I went directly to my attorney's office. Sarah had handled my husband's estate after his death and had helped me draft my will. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "I want to protect whatever assets I have left," I explained, "and I want to formalize the money I've given them as loans, not gifts, with a repayment schedule." Sarah nodded. "We can do that. But Crystal, have you spoken to James about this decision?" "No," I admitted. "I don't think a conversation would be productive at this point. Actions need to speak where words have failed." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing my financial records. I had brought every receipt, bank statement, and transfer record related to funds I had provided to James and Stephanie. Sarah was methodical, organizing them chronologically and by category. The final tally was sobering. 174 separate financial transactions, Sarah said, looking up from her calculator, totaling just over $230,000, not including the initial house down payment. I nodded, feeling oddly detached from the astronomical figure. This was money I would likely never see again, money that should have been supporting my retirement years. Sarah drafted formal documents reclassifying the funds as loans with reasonable repayment terms and minimal interest. She also helped me revise my will, which had previously left everything to James. Now a significant portion would go to the education fund I had established at the library where I volunteered. "I'll have these documents delivered to them by courier tomorrow," Sarah said. "And Crystal, I'm proud of you. This is a difficult but necessary step." When I returned home, I turned my phone back on. There were 12 missed calls and 23 text messages, all from James or Stephanie. The first few were angry. "What do you mean by changes? We're counting on your help." Then they became accusatory. "After everything we've done for you," finally they turned pleading. "Mom, please call us back. We need to talk." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I made a cup of tea and sat on my porch watching the neighborhood children play. I thought about James at that age, his laughter, when I would push him on the swings, his small hand trustingly in mine. Somewhere along the way, that trust had been corrupted into entitlement. That evening, I composed a single email to both James and Stephanie. I explained that I had reviewed my financial contributions to their lives and found the arrangement unsustainable. I had formalized the previous contributions as loans with reasonable repayment expectations. Most importantly, I would no longer be providing additional financial support. This decision, I wrote, comes not from anger, but from the recognition that our relationship has become transactional rather than familial. I will always love you, James, but I can no longer enable a dynamic that diminishes my worth to that of a financial resource. I sent the email and then turned off my phone again. I needed space to hold firm in my decision without being swayed by emotional appeals or manipulative tactics. The next morning, Sarah called my landline to inform me that the courier had delivered the documents. Within an hour, James was at my door, his face a mixture of anger and panic. "Mom, what is this?" he demanded, waving the legal papers. "Loans, repayment schedules. Is this some kind of joke?" I invited him in calmly. "It's not a joke, James. It's a correction of an unhealthy pattern." For the next hour, James cycled through various strategies to change my mind. He yelled about how I was ruining their lives. He reminded me of all the times he had been there for me. Examples were notably sparse. He accused me of never liking Stephanie. Finally, he broke down in tears, claiming they would lose the house without my support. "The house is well within your combined income," I said gently. "You might need to cut back on renovations and dinner parties, but you won't lose it." He left without resolving anything, slamming the door so hard that the frame rattled. Within minutes, my phone was ringing again. This time it was Stephanie, her voice. Honey sweet, in a way I had never heard directed at me. "Crystal, there's been a misunderstanding. We value you so much. James is devastated. We were actually planning a surprise for your birthday, but it was for Saturday, not Friday." The ease with which she lied was almost impressive. I knew from my neighbor that their event preparations had been the previous weekend, not for an upcoming Saturday celebration. And James's text had been explicitly clear. "I appreciate the call, Stephanie, but my decision stands. I'm happy to have a relationship with you both that isn't centered around financial support." Over the next week, the calls and texts continued relentlessly. James's tone fluctuated between anger and pleading. Stephanie left voicemails about family unity and forgiveness. They even sent mutual friends to speak with me, people I hadn't seen them interact with in years. Through it all, I maintained my position with a calm I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming my dignity and redefining our relationship on healthier terms. The financial consequences for them were significant. Without my contributions, they had to adjust their lifestyle considerably. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had canceled an upcoming vacation and postponed several home improvement projects. James had taken on additional clients at work, and Stephanie was working weekends, something she had previously refused to do. As difficult as it was to stand firm, I found strength in my support network. Lisa came over regularly with dinner and unwavering encouragement. My therapy sessions helped me work through the guilt that occasionally surfaced. And my volunteer work at the library provided purpose and community. 3 months after my decision, the desperate calls and messages finally stopped. James sent a formal email acknowledging the loan documents and proposing a modified payment schedule, which my attorney reviewed and accepted. It was businesslike and distant, but it was progress of a sort. At least they were accepting the new reality. The hardest part wasn't the conflict or even the financial adjustment to my new circumstances. It was the deafening silence that followed. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing estrangement from my only child. There were days when the pain of that reality threatened to overwhelm me, but each time I reminded myself that sometimes love requires difficult boundaries, especially when respect has been compromised. 6 months passed in a strange new reality. The seasons changed from summer to fall, then to winter. I adjusted to my quieter life, focusing on self-care and rebuilding the retirement savings that had been so depleted. I took a part-time position coordinating events at the library, which provided both additional income and social connection. The pain remained, but it no longer dominated my days. On a snowy December morning, I was surprised to find James waiting beside my car in the library parking lot after my shift. He looked different somehow, smaller and less polished. The designer coat he wore seemed rumpled, and his eyes held a weariness I hadn't seen before. "Mom," he said simply, "can we talk?" We went to a nearby cafe, sitting at a corner table with steaming mugs between us. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The weight of unsaid words hung heavy in the air. Finally, James looked up. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, and some therapy, actually." He gave a humorless laugh. "Turns out I have issues with money and validation and a bunch of other stuff." I waited, giving him space to continue. "The past 6 months have been challenging. Stephanie and I have had to make a lot of adjustments. We've had some difficult conversations." He paused. "We're separating, actually. Trial separation. For now." This news surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. I had seen how their relationship functioned, the imbalance of power, the focus on material acquisitions over emotional connection. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I had never wished unhappiness on either of them. "Don't be," James replied. "It's probably overdue. But that's not why I wanted to talk to you." He took a deep breath. "I need to apologize. The way I've treated you, the way I allowed Stephanie to treat you, it was inexcusable. You've been nothing but supportive my entire life, and I took that for granted. Worse, I exploited it." I felt tears forming but held them back. "Thank you for saying that." James continued, his voice becoming more emotional. "When I got your email, I was angry, then scared, then defensive. It took months for me to really hear what you were saying. But you were right. Our relationship had become transactional, and I was the one who made it that way." We talked for hours longer than we had in years. James shared his struggles, how he had become caught up in Stephanie's world of status and appearances, gradually losing sight of the values I had raised him with. He admitted feeling inadequate financially compared to Stephanie's family, which led to overcompensating with an unsustainable lifestyle. "The text about your birthday," he said, his voice breaking. "I've thought about that moment every day since. I can't believe I wrote those words to you. Stephanie was pressuring me about the client dinner, but that's no excuse. I should have stood up for you. I should have remembered what that day meant to us." As painful as this conversation was, it felt like lancing a wound, allowing healing to finally begin. I shared my own perspective, how the gradual exclusion had hurt more than the financial strain, how I had felt erased from his life, except when money was needed. "I don't expect things to be fixed immediately," I told him. "Trust takes time to rebuild. But I would like to try, if you're willing." James nodded, wiping away tears. "I'd like that too. And I want you to know I'm committed to repaying what I owe you both financially and emotionally. I've taken a second position consulting on weekends to increase my income." We established new boundaries that day. We would start with weekly phone calls and monthly lunches, gradually rebuilding our connection. James would continue the loan repayments, as agreed, without requests for additional support. Most importantly, we would practice honest communication, even when it was difficult. As for the house, James explained that he was living there while Stephanie stayed with her parents. "We're not sure what will happen long term. We might sell it and split whatever equity exists after repaying you." The road to reconciliation wasn't smooth. There were difficult conversations, misunderstandings, and moments when old patterns threatened to reemerge. I maintained the boundaries I had established, gently but firmly redirecting, when James occasionally slipped into expecting financial assistance. Stephanie and I had one civil but distant conversation when she came to collect some belongings while I was visiting James. She seemed diminished, somehow less confident in her assertions about what constituted success or proper family dynamics. The separation had apparently prompted some reflection for her as well. 3 months after our cafe conversation, James invited me to dinner at the house. It was a simple meal he had cooked himself, not catered or elaborate. As we sat in the kitchen, rather than the formal dining room, there was a sense of authenticity that had been missing from our previous interactions in that space. "I've been thinking about selling," he said, looking around. "It's too big for one person, and honestly, it never felt like home. It felt like a statement." I nodded, understanding completely. Home isn't about square footage or imported countertops. "You taught me that once," he said quietly. "I forgot a lot of what you taught me, Mom. I'm trying to remember now." Beyond my personal situation, this experience transformed how I approached life. I became more involved in my community, particularly in a support group for older adults, navigating complex family dynamics. Sharing my story helped others recognize unhealthy patterns in their own relationships and find the courage to establish boundaries. My friendship circle expanded beyond what it had been in years. I joined a travel group for seniors, taking my first trip to the Grand Canyon, something I had always wanted to do. I started a small book club at the library that quickly became popular among local retirees. Life took on new dimensions I hadn't imagined possible in my 70s. When James and I celebrated my 71st birthday, it was with a quiet dinner at my favorite local restaurant. No expensive gifts or grand gestures, just genuine conversation and a handmade card that reminded me of those he had created as a child. "I've learned something important this year," I told him, as we shared dessert. "Love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be devalued. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do both for yourself and the other person is to say no." James reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I needed that lesson. I just wish it hadn't been so painful for you to teach it." The journey wasn't over, of course. Relationships, especially those damaged by betrayal, require ongoing maintenance and attention. But we were on a healthier path, one where mutual respect accompanied love, where boundaries were recognized rather than exploited. If you're watching this and find yourself in a similar situation, please know that establishing boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary. Your worth isn't determined by how much you give or sacrifice. Sometimes the bravest act of love is saying, "This isn't acceptable anymore." Have you ever had to establish difficult boundaries with family members? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, true family lifts you up. They don't drain you dry.